The scent of buttercream and overwhelming perfume hung in the air on my wedding day. The band had just eased into a gentler melody when my mother leaned toward me, her smile perfectly positioned for the cameras, and casually announced that she was handing the car Evan's parents had gifted me over to my sister. Her delivery was breezy, rehearsed, like she was simply adjusting the centerpieces. Danielle stood beside her, her sequined dress catching the light, as she laughed and told me to relax because it was just a car. None of the guests noticed anything wrong, but my stomach dropped somewhere cold and permanent. My husband stood still beside me, his expression unreadable and composed. That look told me everything. People claim weddings show you who truly loves you. Mine showed me who never had. Growing up in my family meant learning that fairness was something spoken about at dinner, never actually practiced. My mother, Grace, valued appearances above everything, the kind of order that kept her looking gracious while keeping me silent. My father, Richard, believed that saying nothing was the same as solving something. And then there was Danielle, my younger sister, the fragile one the whole world seemed to rotate around. I was the hinge that kept the whole machine moving. As children, she received the larger bedroom because she feared the dark. When she wrecked her first car, my mother blamed the weather. I worked extra shifts to purchase mine, and my mother called it character development. Danielle was the reason I existed as a resource. That dynamic shaped me entirely, one person always taking, another always rationalizing it. By the time I was 29, I had carved out a life completely outside their expectations. I worked as an interior designer, disciplined and self-sufficient, a woman who settled her own debts and didn't borrow anything she couldn't return. Meeting Evan felt like stepping into warmth that didn't scorch. He came from a family that understood what words like respect and boundaries actually meant. His parents weren't wealthy, but they were generous in ways that required nothing financial, only presence, trust, and the willingness to give someone room to breathe. At our rehearsal dinner, his father pressed a small silver key inside an envelope into my hands and said we had built something real together and deserved something to carry us forward. A used car, clean and dependable, registered in my name alone. The metal didn't matter. What it represented did. Trust, partnership, a gesture meant to protect rather than extract. That night, I noticed my mother's expression tighten slightly. Before she smoothed it into politeness, she thanked Evan's parents with practiced charm and called it thoughtful. But her gaze cut sideways toward Danielle like a reflex. I should have read that moment for exactly what it was. The morning of the wedding, she hovered around me, adjusting my veil and telling me how proud she was. She said I had always been the giving one, and told me not to lose that quality. Her perfume filled the space around us, dense and suffocating. I smiled and pretended not to decode the message wrapped inside her compliment, but somewhere underneath I already understood. Certain things are not meant to be shared, and yet here we were. The reception felt like being trapped inside a film with the volume turned up too high. Laughter bounced off every surface. Glasses clinked endlessly, and every smile around me felt performed. Evan's hand rested warm against my back as we moved through our first dance, and for just a moment it seemed like everything might hold together. Then I saw my mother threading through the crowd, her expression already set into that particular smile she saved for public performances. She positioned herself beside us and spoke loudly enough for nearby tables to overhear, announcing her intention to transfer the car to Danielle as though she were simply reassigning a parking space. Every sound in the room seemed to blur at the edges. Someone laughed at a distant table. The singer stretched out a long note that suddenly sounded like an alarm. Danielle materialized beside my mother, sparkling under the string lights, shrugging casually and repeating that I should relax because it was just a car. It was never about the car. It was about every single thing that had ever been lifted from me and repackaged as an act of generosity. I studied my mother's face, serene and self-assured, absolutely certain of her authority. She tilted her chin slightly, waiting for me to respond. With the gracious acceptance she had trained me to perform, she added that Evan and I could manage fine sharing one vehicle and that I had always been the practical one. A guest captured the moment on camera, catching my mother's hand resting on my arm and her wide-open smile. No photograph would show how her fingers pressed in. I said nothing. Evan's thumb grazed the inside of my wrist, a silent question, checking whether I was holding together. I breathed through the taste of frosting and old obedience and kept my face still. My father drifted over, drawn by the shift in energy. He asked what was happening. My mother answered immediately, keeping her voice light, saying she was simply helping Danielle, who had always had terrible luck with vehicles. Danielle laughed softly alongside her and announced that I wouldn't mind sharing. That word, sharing, hit me like something physical. I thought about the night I had stayed up rewriting Danielle's resume, the dress she borrowed and never returned, the countless times I had smoothed over her mistakes with quiet apologies. Every small surrender had been labeled love. I smiled then, measured and controlled, and agreed that they were right. I said I didn't mind sharing at all. My mother relaxed, reading compliance where there was none. Evan didn't make that mistake. His hand found mine again and held on. Later, after the cake was cut and the room began to thin, I smiled through every photograph and accepted congratulations that felt hollow. When the final guests drifted toward the exits, Evan and I slipped out through a side door into a quieter hallway. He loosened his collar and asked if I wanted him to say something to them. I told him no because we had already handled it. He looked puzzled for a moment and then understood. Months earlier, over takeout containers spread across our kitchen table, we had spoken half-jokingly about my mother's tendency to treat my belongings as shared family property. It wasn't a new pattern. It was deeply established. So I had made a quiet decision to stop being inheritable. 2 weeks before the wedding, a colleague of mine who also worked as a paralegal had helped me draft a notarized declaration. Every gift received under my name was legally protected from being transferred, sold, or reassigned without my written approval. Evan and I had both signed it in blue ink. I still remembered her exact words when she stamped the document. She told me this wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. Standing in that hallway with Evan beside me, I thought about that moment. I had hoped none of this would be necessary. I had hoped they might surprise me, but I hadn't wanted to bleed again without something to slow it. Evan's phone buzzed. A guest had sent him a screenshot. Danielle had already posted a photo of herself standing next to the car in our driveway with a caption declaring she had finally found a ride that suited her. I let out one short, dry laugh. She hadn't even waited until morning. We straightened ourselves, fixed our expressions, and walked back into the ballroom. My mother was stationed near the cake table performing her best version of effortless charm. Danielle hovered nearby with her phone pretending to scroll. When they spotted us, my mother called out warmly as though we had simply stepped away for air. She mentioned that Danielle would need a ride home soon. Evan stepped forward just slightly and asked whether she already had one, gesturing toward the car. My mother blinked. I told her we were simply referencing the car she had announced Danielle would be taking. Danielle tensed. My father appeared trying to broker calm and asked us not to do this here. I turned to him and said quietly that she had chosen to do it here, in front of everyone, so here was exactly where it needed to be addressed. The band lost its rhythm briefly before recovering. A few nearby guests turned their heads. My mother's expression stiffened as she told me I was overreacting and insisted it had been a misunderstanding. Evan extended the envelope toward her. He suggested she read its contents before finishing her sentence. Her hand hesitated before accepting it. She looked between Danielle and me before unfolding the paper. The sound of it opening cut clearly through the music. Danielle leaned in to read alongside her. Confusion crossed their faces first, then slow recognition, then something draining from both of them all at once. My mother forced a short laugh and asked what she was holding. I told her it was a notarized legal declaration signed 2 weeks prior stating that all wedding gifts titled in my name were protected from being transferred, gifted, or sold without my written consent, and that any attempt to do so would trigger a legal review and forfeit any future inheritance from Evan's family. That final detail landed like something dropped from a height. Nearby conversations stopped. Someone whispered an expression of disbelief. Danielle made a short, panicked sound and said I couldn't possibly be serious. I told her I was completely serious. My father exhaled heavily and called it petty. I told him gently that petty was dressing theft up as family tradition. My mother's voice hardened. She said families didn't treat each other like criminals. I reminded her that she had accessed our garage the previous night and that Danielle had photographed the car and broadcast it publicly. Danielle said it had been a joke. Evan asked quietly what exactly it had been symbolic of. She had no answer. I turned to my mother and told her this was never about the car. It was about a pattern repeated across my entire life, one where she labeled taking as love and expected me to call it generosity in return. She snapped that I was being theatrical. I acknowledged that might be true, but said this particular theatrics had an audience. Phones around the room were half raised, half hidden. Someone's relative mouthed something behind her champagne glass. Danielle's voice cracked as she asked whether I would really humiliate the family this way. I told her I wasn't humiliating anyone. I was simply declining to keep following a script that had never been written in my favor. Evan rested his hand in mine, steadying me. He addressed my mother evenly and suggested she hold on to the document because it was legally binding. She stared at him as though he had personally betrayed her and accused him of encouraging all of this. He said simply that I hadn't needed encouragement, only respect. Danielle's face flushed red as she asked whether marrying well had made me think I was superior. I answered her directly. Not superior, I said, just someone who finally understood what limits were for. The words sat in the air between us, like something from another language entirely. My mother made one final attempt, her voice unsteady now, saying she had raised me to be kind. I told her she had raised me to give without limit and had taught Danielle to take without question. That sentence split the air in two. The band went quiet entirely. Even the lighting seemed to waver. Danielle stepped closer, shaking, and told me I would regret this. I said softly that I already had for 29 years. For the first time in my memory, my mother's composure fractured. Her voice broke slightly as she asked me not to do this in front of everyone. I reminded her that she had made her choice in front of everyone first. She opened her mouth again and found nothing. The silence that followed had weight and texture. Evan leaned toward the band and quietly asked them to play something. The drummer hesitated. The singer looked toward me. I nodded. Music rose again, soft and almost defiant, a heartbeat returning. Evan guided me back to the floor, and the guests parted around us. In the mirrors, I caught glimpses of my mother standing pale and motionless, Danielle with her mascara beginning to blur, my father staring at the floor. The envelope rested on the table between empty glasses. Evan whispered for me to breathe. I told him I already was, and for once it was completely true. When the song finished, I turned toward my parents still frozen near the remaining cake and said plainly that help was not the same as taking, and love was not the same as unlimited access. I set my champagne glass down beside the envelope and walked away through the quiet stairs with Evan beside me. Outside under the string lights, I finally exhaled everything I had been holding. Evan pulled me close and asked if I was okay. I told him I thought I had just stopped apologizing. He smiled and said it was long overdue. We stepped into the dark together, with the music still humming faintly behind the closed doors. Inside, somewhere, the smile my mother had worn my entire life finally came apart. The drive home was the kind of quiet that feels like something earned. City lights drifted past soft and distant. I rolled down the window and let the wind pull at my veil until it released and disappeared into the night. Evan laughed quietly and said I had just discarded my cinematic moment. I told him that was fine because I didn't want one. We held hands and drove in silence, that same car they had tried to claim humming beneath us. Each mile felt like measured distance from an old injury. When we reached home, Evan cut the engine but sat still. He said softly that I had done it. I asked, done what? He said, broken the pattern. Inside the kitchen still carried the scent of morning coffee we hadn't finished. I stepped out of my shoes and felt the cool tile beneath my feet. My phone was stacked with missed calls from my mother and Danielle, and numbers I didn't recognize. I placed it face down on the counter. Outside crickets filled the night. For the first time in as long as I could remember, the silence didn't ache. It simply settled around me like something finally fitting right. A week passed and I stood in the same kitchen watching sunlight move across the floor. The house was unchanged, the car still in the driveway, but everything inside me felt restructured from the wiring out. On the refrigerator, one photo remained from the wedding, the moment my mother's composure had slipped and I had held the envelope steady. I used to think it looked harsh when I looked at it. Now it looked honest. Freedom, I had come to understand, doesn't announce itself loudly. It arrives quietly. It sounds like a phone that has stopped ringing, like doors you can lock without carrying guilt behind them. I looked at that photograph and said under my breath that boundaries don't destroy families. They define them. If you have ever had to draw a line with someone who called that line cruelty, your story belongs somewhere too. You are not alone in this, and your peace is not something you owe to anyone.